So welcome to this Interspecies Conversations lecture. My name is Kate Armstrong. I'm head of program at the Interspecies Internet. So this is a regular online lecture and workshop series that gives the opportunity to invite leading professors, scientists, researchers, and students to share and present their work that contributes to advancing the acceleration and understanding of the diversities, forms and functions of communication in other species. We aim to showcase emerging ideas and discoveries and host open discussions where the community can join the conversation and with ideas and feedback. Today will be a 50-minute discussion followed by a Q&A with Lars Chittka. He will speak about the mind of a bee. So most of us are aware of the hive mind, the power of bees as an amazing collective. But do we know how uniquely intelligent bees are as individuals? Lars, Professor of Sensory and Behavioural Ecology, draws from decades of research, including his own pioneering work, to argue that bees have remarkable cognitive abilities. So now I'll pass over to Lars, who will take the floor.
All right. Well, thank you very much for this very kind introduction. Let's see if we can look at some slides here. Can you now all see a cover slide?
We can.
Magnificent. All right. So I've spent the last few decades researching bees' abilities in recognizing visual patterns. And so you might wonder why from there I've got to presumptuous enough to refer to minds of bees in recent years and why that's of interest. And I think I can't sum up the fascination with the world of bees better than Maurice Maeterlinck already did over a century ago when he wrote, "What have we to do, some will ask, with the intelligence of bees? The discovery of a sign of true intellect outside ourselves procures us something of the emotion Robinson Crusoe felt when he saw the imprint of a human foot on the sandy beach of his island. We seemed less solitary than we had believed." So that's a statement that I'm hopefully going to fill with some meat in the coming half hour or so. There is a fascination for a kind of alien life on our very home planet, a very different kind of perception, a different kind of psychology that I'm going to explain in a minute. So the question of whether an animal has a mind or a kind of consciousness breaks down into two broad categories. The questions of whether they have the capacity to think and to feel. And by thinking, I mean an animal in whose head it's not permanently dark, that doesn't just respond to incoming stimuli by way of pre-configured hardwired behaviors, but some animal that can at least foresee into the immediate future and that can also have flexible access to past memories and combine them into new forms of information. So I'll explore a bit intelligent problem solving that's indicative of these kinds of flexible usages of memories and solving tasks that indicate an outcome awareness. And I also want to see if bees could be said to have emotion-like states. The notion that you're all probably familiar with, which I guess is shown in this kind of image, is yes, social insects can do very complex things. They can build magnificently regular architectures by way of collaborative efforts, but the common perception is that they do so entirely by hardwired, innate, pre-configured behaviors. And that's something I want to deconstruct a little bit today. I also want to explore whether there's likely going to be any kind of interspecies communication with the bees. And I suspect, frankly, there won't be. We can, of course, understand and decode the bees' communication between themselves. But in the case, other than a few exceptional cases, such as Fiona Presley here, and who actually befriended a bumblebee queen, I don't think that bees are likely to want to get on the internet anytime soon to communicate with us. But what I'll hopefully try to explain is that we are all connected to the world of bees in perhaps ways that you haven't previously thought of. Everyone's aware that we need bees because they pollinate our crops, and they're responsible for the beautiful colored dots that are flowers in our environment that would otherwise, without the existence of bees, just be green. But I want to emphasize that we are way more deeply connected to the world of bees, and perhaps even our very being, our intelligence, to the world of bees. So the first thing that's important to recognize when we talk about bees is what they do on a daily basis. What is their task, their goal in life? And one of these tasks is flower visitation. And in that context, bees see the world in wholly different colors to the way we do. They can see ultraviolet, which is inaccessible to us. And that, of course, is a healthy reminder that the world we see is not the physical or the veridical world. Every animal sees the world through the specific filters that they have acquired through their evolutionary past. And in this task of being a flower visitor, of course, bees have to make economic choices to find those flower species that contain the highest rewards. Remember their signals, their colors, their patterns, and their scents, and then focus their foraging efforts on just these particular flowers that have the best cost-to-benefit ratio. And in doing that, they are actually doing a similar task as we do when we're shopping in a supermarket. We might associate a particular product, let's say our favorite brand of toothpaste, where we've discovered, okay, that's a good quality product for a relatively affordable cost. And then we memorize the packaging, the advertising, that's the flower pattern, and return to the same product again and again, using our memory of its appearance until perhaps the product quality changes or prices go up. And that's this economic choice task is one that makes bees very good pattern learners. And bees' flexibility in associating rewards with indicators of these rewards is very impressive. So here what we see in panel B is a bee about to land on a little platform to collect a droplet of sugar water. That's how we always do our experiments. We reward them with a bit of nectar in front of an image of a human face. And she does that a few times. And then we present the bees with something like a crime witness test, as in panel A, where we now show her multiple different faces in spatially shuffled positions, and now there's no reward present. And we then ask, can you now find the particular face that you've just had a reward with? And indeed, it turns out that bees are very good at identifying images of human faces. With this caricature, they're almost 90%, but even with some of these relatively similar faces, they get up to about 80% correct discrimination. Now, many people would say that's still a task that is similar to flower recognition. It's just a different kind of pattern, but still a kind of pattern that's simply associated with rewards. And some of our colleagues working with primates and clever corvid birds and so on have always said, well, yes, we believe that bees can be good at associating patterns, color signals with rewards, but that's what they naturally have to do. It's a bee's job description to be able to do that. But of course, so our primate colleagues would say, we challenge our animals with tasks that they never encountered in their evolutionary past to probe their flexibility. And here's one such task. I'll show you a little video that was actually filmed in our lab, how we can probe bees' intelligence better.
We've recently discovered something even more surprising about insects. It turns out that some are really, really smart. One test of intelligence in animals is when they're given a problem, they can work out a solution in their heads. Hang a piece of food from a perch, out of reach, and a smart bird like a raven soon works out what to do. Just pull the string, hold it with your foot, pull a bit more, and in no time at all, you have a snack. Yet anything a mere vertebrate can do, bumblebees can also do this, even though they must be trained to solve the problem. Pull the string and reach a reward of nectar. Now, this bee hasn't been trained at all. But if she's allowed to watch her nestmate solving the problem, she knows exactly what to do when she gets her turn. Teachers and students, and all with brains only the size of pinheads. Combine this with the flexibility of the basic insect layout, and there's not much that insects can't do.
So what you can do if you pair teachers and students or demonstrators and observers in this way with multiple bees, in fact, all individuals of a colony, is that you can observe the spread of this skill like a kind of meme in a social media network in the human realm. So what we've done here is we've arranged all individuals of a bumblebee colony in a circle. So each dot is one bee. And yellow 31 at the top here is our innovator, is the individual that solved the task first. And once there is an interaction of the kind that you've just seen, where two individuals interact, a line forms between two dots. And whenever a dot turns colored, that's the first time the target individual can solve the task by herself. They're invariably females, these workers. And so you can see now there's a good number of orange dots. That's our second generation learners, so to speak, after the yellow 31 at the top. But you can now also see a number of purple bees down here. And these are actually, that's our third generation of learners. So these are individuals that have no longer picked up the task from our yellow 31, the first innovator, but from the orange bees, from the second generation. So there's several sequential sets of individuals learning from each other. And in this particular colony, this unique skill that has never been solved by any bee in their evolutionary history continues to spread even after the end of the life of our yellow 31. Bees only live for a few weeks, so it's natural for them to, that some of them might pass away during an experiment like that if it's done for a sufficiently long time. But it's really a culture-like phenomenon, a skill that spreads socially and can then be maintained in this colony. And if you do this kind of training with multiple bees, then indeed it appears as if they're collaborating at the efforts of pulling strings together. So what you're seeing here is a good number of individually marked bees that manage to pull the strings jointly. Now for the next experiment, I'll let Dame Jane Goodall do the introduction.
The most recent example which blows people's minds is the bumblebee. And the bumblebee has been taught to roll a little ball. He rolls it backwards. He rolls the little ball until he can push it down, or maybe she, I don't know, into a hole, like a goal. And as soon as this little ball gets into the goal, the bumblebee is given a little drop of nectar as a reward. So they learn to do this. But the mind-blowing thing is other bumblebees who've merely watched a taught bumblebee can do the same without being taught, just by watching. And that is supposed to be a mark of very superior intelligence. So this is something we're learning all the time. We have been far too arrogant. The animal kingdom of which we are a part is filled with secrets. And gosh, I'd love to be young and learning about these things now, because all the doors are wide open and you never know what you're going to find.
Yeah, so this for me was very moving because Jane Goodall was one of my heroes, heroines, when I was young and decided to go into animal behavior in the first place. And for her to even take notice of our work and say that, hey, I'd like to be young now and study bees was quite something, of course. Now, the experiment here is a little more complicated than the one we've seen before, in that there are multiple ways of solving the task. And so what you see here are 3 balls, all at different distances from the goal area. And of course, a good way of solving the task is to pick the closest ball and move that to the center. But our skilled bee here, the one down here, actually knows that won't work because she has learned that this ball and that ball are glued down. They can't be moved. So she learns to move the furthest ball, and that's what she does. So she rolls that ball to the center, and this naive observer that has no experience with rolling balls for rewards just scrounges on the reward when it's given to the successful ball rolling bee. But we do that 3 times. So every time this naive observer just watches what the other bee does and gets a reward on top. And then we put that observer on the spot and ask, well, hey, how would you now solve that task? So here's that situation. The observer is now alone. And the question is, will she simply ape the demonstrator and copy the actions without actually being aware that this is a suboptimal action? Or can she find a better way of solving the task? Oops, I'm sorry. And she picks the closest ball. She spontaneously and without trial and error picks a better way of solving the task than has been demonstrated to her. And that, to us, at least, indicates some form of outcome awareness, that look into the immediate future. Where do I want to go with my actions? And solving the problem in her mind, rather than through trial and error, trying out which might be the quickest or least energy costly solution to the task, but doing this task spontaneously in a better way than has been demonstrated. So there's a spontaneous improvement of something that was socially learned. Now, can bees picture things? Can they imagine things in their minds? Do they store flowers, for example, in the form of mental images? What you can see here is a bee scanning her environment. These boomerang shapes are the views through a bee's eyes. And it seems obvious, well, bees can memorize flower patterns, so surely there must be some sort of mental representation. But it's actually not so simple, because it turns out that you can actually store images without a kind of mental awareness. Your phone can recognize your face, for example, but it can't imagine it. And so one way of addressing this question, whether there's a mental representation, is in cross-modal recognition, is in a task where you memorize a shape, the properties of a thing in one sensory modality, vision in this case, and then you ask, can you now recognize the same objects in a different sensory modality, such as touch? So what we've done here is we've trained bees to recognize either balls or cubes, depending on which group of bees it was, and associate them with rewards again, and then ask, can they now recognize the same objects using their tactile sense? So the task here is a little bit like the probably now extinct birthday party kiddie game, where you would ask children who were either blindfolded or they would reach into a bag and would have to recognize, retrieve an object such as a spoon, a screwdriver, a key, with touch alone. And that requires that you somehow imagine the thing that you're meant to look for and that you've previously only been presented using your vision. And so this is what we did. We trained the bees in a look but don't touch scenario, where they saw the objects through a lid but couldn't touch them, and then tested the same individuals in complete darkness under infrared light, which bees can't see. And in this case, allowed them to touch the objects. And it turned out that the bees trained to associate round things with a reward using vision were able to recognize these things in complete darkness using their touch sense. And you can do the inverse as well. So what we see here is a bee that has been trained in darkness on associating cubes with rewards. And if you subsequently test such bees in daylight, but in a situation where they can now not touch the objects, just see them, you can see this bee is now inspecting a ball using vision, rejects it, and flies back to one of the cubes to retrieve her reward. And that indeed indicates to us that there is a kind of mental representation, that bees can think about the shape that they're looking for and access it from different sensory modalities that they're trained on, which of course indicates it's not just a sensory signal configuration that comes from their eyes that they've learned, but they've actually got a way of finding the same objects using completely different sensory stimuli. Now, given that we've done all this work where bees had to learn to do various things with balls, I guess the next natural question asked by PhD students in Madigal was, do bees actually like to play with balls? And so in this particular study, there was no reward, no appetitive reward, no food ever linked to the balls. The bees were given a kind of playground area where they found these objects to manipulate, but they also had access to food in a different area in their environment, and they could also freely fly in other parts. So they came back again and again to this play area, even though there was never any reward given to them, to roll these balls all over the place, indicating that indeed there was some sort of inherent enjoyment in the activity of rolling the balls about. Unsurprisingly, perhaps younger individuals engaged in this activity more than older individuals. And even more unsurprisingly, perhaps males did it a lot more than female individuals. Males do absolutely no useful work for the colony, so they have a lot more time on their hands, perhaps. Now, this takes us to the next question. If there's an inherent enjoyment in an activity, a kind of play-like behavior, then could bees be said to have emotion-like states? And that's what we're investigating more formally in this study. We're basically asking if, in a bee's case, can the glass be half full or half empty? And so in this proverbial glass, of course, the idea is that there's an ambiguous stimulus that physically is neutral. It's exactly 50% filled with a drink, that glass. And you might ask a person who is in a good or a poor mental state, or is generally optimistic or pessimistic about that same stimulus. And one person will say, oh, it's already half empty, it's almost all gone, and be all sad about it. And the optimistic person would say, oh, that's still pretty good, there's still a lot in there, and be quite content with that same stimulus. And a lot of studies have been done with vertebrates, basically using versions of this paradigm to ask if domestic animals, but also laboratory rats, are in an environment that's conducive to their well-being or not, as the case may be. And so we basically, again, used the bee version of this paradigm. The bee flies into a little flight arena where she's given 5 options to on the back wall, and only in one of them, in this particular group, is there a reward. So you can see blue on the left here in that little tunnel, there is a reward. When there's green on the right, so that's our negative stimulus, when that comes up, there's never a reward. And so the bee learns this for a few dozen trials. Blue is good, blue on the left is good, green on the right, there's never any reward. And then we face her with these ambiguous stimuli. That's now our glass 50% filled, like turquoise, for example. And we ask, well, how do you judge this new stimulus that's exactly in the middle? Is that more likely a good thing or a bad thing to you? And so after training, after the bees have learned blue on the left is good, green on the right, there's never a reward, we can evaluate their hesitation with which they accept these stimuli. And we find that if blue is offered, they, without hesitation, fly straight to that target. Green, they've already learned whenever you give me green, you're not giving me anything. So they're flying about for several minutes until finally they might go, okay, well, if there's nothing else, if you're not giving me any blue, then I might as well try this green one more time. But it takes a long period of hesitation before they'll do that. And now the question is, what do they do with the ambiguous stimulus, the glass 50% filled? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And it turns out, so we're again measuring the bees' flight behavior en route to the target. It turns out that their readiness to accept this ambiguous stimulus depends on what happened to the bees before they have actually entered the flight arena. If we give the bees a tiny drop of a surprise nectar reward before they're coming in, they judge this ambiguous stimulus, the turquoise, as being more likely a rewarding stimulus. So in this graph on the right, the response times to the positive stimulus, blue on the left, are always very short, just about 10 seconds, less than 10 seconds, and they land there. The negative stimulus, green on the right, they're spending on average about 2 minutes before accepting it. But the interesting thing is what happens with the stimuli in between. And if the bees have been given this surprise reward before they're doing the task, that's the red curve here, then for all the ambiguous intermediate stimuli, the response times are shorter. They're accepting the ambiguous stimuli with less hesitation than they otherwise would without any reward. So that's the black curve here. And it turns out that this optimism-like state is also dopamine dependent, exactly as it is in humans. So they get a little dopamine hit from their surprise reward and then respond to ambiguous stimuli as more likely being something good. And it turns out from Geraldine Wright's work at Oxford that you can do the inverse as well. If the bees are subjected to a simulated predator attack before they do the task, then the entire curve shifts in the opposite direction. And ambiguous stimuli are now met with greater hesitation. So there are indeed, by the same criteria as in other animals, optimism and pessimism-like emotional states in the bees. Now, I won't go too deeply into the brains of bees, except I wish to make you appreciate their beautiful sophistication of this biological microcomputer that is the bee brain. They have fewer than 1 million neurons. So from that angle, you might conclude that their brains are relatively simple. But it turns out that actually everything is just elegantly miniaturized. So here are the optic ganglia. They process visual information. It turns out that the diversity of neuron types in these lamina, medulla, and lobular ganglia is higher than the diversity of neurons in the human retina. So there's an immense complexity of visual information processing. Up here are the so-called mushroom bodies, up on top, which are centers of multisensory integration, perhaps facilitating the kinds of cross-modal recognition tasks that we've seen earlier. And they're also sites of learning and memory. Now, the notion that insect brains are simple deteriorates somewhat once you look at the immense complexity of individual neurons, nerve cells in a bee's brain. Here's one such cell, and you can see that its branching patterns is probably as complex as that of a fully grown tree. So it has very wide ramifications throughout the antennal lobe, which process olfactory information, as well as the mushroom bodies. And this is just one cell. Now imagine 1 million of these. And each such nerve cell can make up to 10,000 connections, synapses, with other neurons. And each of these is, again, at least potentially plastic and subject to learning and memory. And this complexity has actually been recognized over a century ago by one of the founding fathers of neuroscience, Ramon y Cajal, who wrote the following about bees' brains. The excellence of the psychic machine does not increase with zoological hierarchy. Instead, one realizes that in fish and amphibians, the nervous centers have undergone an unexpected simplification. Of course, their gray matter has increased considerably in mass, but when the structure of their brains is compared with that of bees or dragonflies, they're excessively plain, coarse, and rudimentary. It is as if one were to pretend to hold as equals the merits of a rough grandfather clock with the quality of a fine pocket watch, a marvel of fineness, delicacy, and precision. As always, in building her marvelous works, nature distinguishes herself much more in her tiny creations than in the large. So what you see on the bottom here is actually a drawing by Ramón y Cajal and his colleague Sánchez y Sánchez, with multiple different nerve cells colored, and they're identifiable neurons. It was one of the first studies where individual neurons were identified in any animal, actually. So bees' brains are small, but they are very astonishingly complex in their wiring diagram. Now from bees' brains to human brains, and we'll see in a minute how the two might be related. The human brain, of course, is quite large in proportion to our body size, and in fact, relative to our closest relatives, chimpanzees, is more than 3 times the size. The species split about 6 million years. And of course, energy, in terms of energy consumption, brains are costly. All brains, neural tissue is a constitutive high cost, no matter if you actually use it at any one time. They constitute, in our case, only about 2% of our body mass, but consume 20% of the energy that we consume. So you need something to power that increase in brain size. And a beautiful theory by some anthropologists is that this increase in brain size might have been powered by our ability to acquire honey. And honey is, of course, the most energy-rich drink available anywhere in nature. Before the advent of our corner stores, where you could just go and buy your Mars bars, you'd have to find sweetness in nature, and the way you could find it in its highest concentrated form is, of course, by raiding bee colony. And it turns out that all our closest relatives, all the great apes, harvest honey from wild bees. And chimps, they even use differently structured tools for raiding stinging honeybees compared to the so-called stingless bees, another clade of social bees that actually can't sting. They can bite, but it's slightly less painful than stings. And of course, in human history, as well as in some cultures that live a little more closely than many of us in the audience probably do, honey hunting to this date takes up a great deal of time. For example, in the Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, they actually have specialized experts hunting for wild bee colonies, and that of course is a very desirable reward if you again can't just go to the supermarket and buy your sweets. And humans often, indeed, in history as well as today, risk their lives just for these sweet goods. So these are Nepalese honey hunters. Some of this honey is also hallucinogenic and used in religious ceremonies. They raid wild bee colonies that don't nest in cavities or in hives, climbing down these very flimsy step ladders without any kind of protection. These bees are actually hornet-sized and very aggressive, but the bounty, I guess, is worth it as far as humans are concerned. And this link to honey as a nutrition and a fascination with honeybees, of course, in humans dates back for as long as there are any kind of documents showing human activities, as evidenced by cave drawings all over the world. So here is the same kind of step ladder facilitated honey hunting in a 6,000-year-old cave drawing in India. Here you can see a similar activity even 2,000 years older in Spain. And here's a colony with horizontal combs indicating these are stingless bees in Zimbabwe. And the theory of Alyssa Crittenden and colleagues about the link between honey hunting and brain evolution basically is the following. It's a beautiful theory. Of course, it's very hard to prove anything like this, but because it's so beautiful, I'd like to present it to you. So the idea is, of course, that the honey of wild bees is the single most nutritious energy drink available in nature. It has been used by our primate ancestors and extant primates for millions of years, quite likely. And it could be that initially subtle differences in the efficiency with which humans and chimpanzees harvested honey could have given an advantage, an edge, a competitive edge in terms of energy acquisition in the humans. This in turn, this energy-hungry evolution of large brains could have facilitated the advent of the usage of better tools, such as, for example, ladders, which, of course, chimps do not yet use. So the theory there is that we owe our very intelligence to our early advantage in perhaps harvesting the energy that was required for evolving large brains. And so we owe bees lots of things, not just the sweetness from the honey and the obvious fruits of their pollination services, or breakfast berries and so on. That utility is, of course, everyone's aware of that, but also light. So people have used candle wax for thousands of years, not just to look pretty, but before the advent of electric light, as the single source of artificial illumination. Inebriation, so people have consumed mead for many thousands of years. You can now, of course, analyze the residue on various pottery finds and so on. Religious inspiration. So the Mayans, for example, as you can see in this beautiful drawing in one of the Mayan codices, there's a very grumpy beekeeper on the right. Here's the hive, and here's the bee queen. The Mayans derived religious inspiration and a mythology from bees. And of course, bees have lent themselves as parallels to all kinds of human societies, as well as to poetry and so on. On the more basic levels, honeybees' wax has also been used as dental fillings. There's a case here of a 500 years old dental filling made from beeswax. So there are lots of things that we owe to the bees, and perhaps even theoretically our large brains and our very intelligence. So some conclusions. I think there is now substantial evidence for intelligence and indeed sentience in bees. And that, I think, should make us recognize that we as humans are, yes, thinking and feeling beings in a world full of other thinking and feeling beings, albeit with very different perceptions and priorities that occupy their minds, but nonetheless, of course, beings that, like us, have their minds full of thoughts and feelings. And indeed, we might owe the evolution of our intelligence and the brains that support it to the honey manufactured by bees, which in turn, of course, is made from sunlight harvested by plants through photosynthesis. And so we might not easily connect with bees through the internet, but we are connected, of course, to the natural world in many ways beyond mere utility. What can the animal do for us? Yes, everyone's aware we should conserve bees because they pollinate our crops. But I think there's a connection between bees and humans here that runs way deeper than this, which I think should inspire some respect for the natural world and places on us the obligation to conserve it much better than we previously had. There's also a book about all this stuff if you've enjoyed this, The Mind of a Bee, but I'll stop here and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lars. I think your last point about, that this is really about conservation and welfare, it really lands with all of us, because this is really what we're doing here. So many of us come for that connective tissue. So thank you so much for this talk. It's wonderful. And I also shared the link to your book in the chat. If you don't mind maybe unsharing your screen, and we already have Con hand up before I've even asked. So that's wonderful. Anybody else who has a question, please pop your hand up and we'll get to you. But Con, please take the floor. It's all yours.
In your wonderful book, Mind of the Bee, which I enjoyed immensely, you mentioned that bees have different personalities and they have different speeds of learning and so on, which to me suggests the possibility that they might recognize each other as individuals. Is there any information to that effect, or is there no information at this point as to whether they do see each other as individual beings?
There's no information in bees, and I suspect at least in some species like honeybees, where there are tens of thousands of workers in a colony that are all very similar, unless they belong to different castes, queens versus workers. I suspect that they probably do not recognize each other as individuals. But
bring other beings in it.
Sorry,
who is combined with
could you please mute if you're not in the current discussion? Thank you. But it's at least plausible, because in some species of wasps, there is exactly that. There are some small colonies of Polystine wasps that have individual face recognition. In those colonies, the numbers is up to about a dozen, with highly individualized facial features. And it turns out, so these wasps form a linear hierarchy with one alpha female at the top, and she monopolizes reproduction, and all the other individuals in a linear hierarchy beneath. And these hierarchies are determined by fighting, by one-on-one duels, which are costly, so you might lose a leg or some other injuries. And so they're best not repeated. And it turns out that these wasps remember one another and remember the other individual's fighting strength. They can even infer it from just watching other individuals fight. So if there's two individuals fighting and another one watching, that watching individual can infer, okay, this one won the battle just now, so I better watch out and approach that individual with hesitation. Whereas with the loser, maybe I'll have a chance beating her and climbing up in the hierarchy. So I suspect it's not because bees' brains are too small, or they can't theoretically solve this task of individual recognition, but because the colonies are typically too populous and there are less individually recognizable features than there are in these wasps. So there are other insects that can do exactly that.
Does that answer your question, Con? Do we need further inquiry?
Yes, thank you. That does.
Wonderful. Thank you. Anybody else have a question for Lars, or maybe a comment? I have B. I don't know your first name, but if you go ahead.
It's B.
Oh, perfect.
Hey there. As you could tell, I'm very into this type of topic. I'm curious. I've heard a lot about a lot of different types of bees, certainly honeybees, having a lot of health issues or parasites or different. There's a lot of challenges that are facing the bees, and I'm wondering, when you all, obviously you're doing work in a setting where hopefully you're taking really good care of the bees, but I'm wondering how those negative impacts on bees are impacting your research.
They aren't, to be quite direct about this. So there is, I guess, a curious representation or a misrepresentation in the media about there being a threat to the domesticated honeybee. And the truth is that the honeybee is not under threat anywhere in the world. It's largely a domesticated animal. Where they are wild, they're not facing many difficulties at all compared to many other wild pollinators. So a lot of the health issues that manifest themselves in honeybees, at least in the most drastic forms, the colony collapse disorder that you might have heard about, is largely the result of fairly ruthless beekeeping practices, where in the United States, for example, a large percentage, probably 2/3 or 3/4 of honeybees are shipped across the country for commercial pollination purposes, and of course are loaded on trucks in conditions that are presumably extremely stressful for bees, are then put into narrow parts of the country, such as in the almond farms in central California, which facilitate disease transmission tremendously. And bees from different colonies are lumped together using basically robotic devices that put the colonies together and so on. So that's when the bees, of course, die en masse because of the facilitations of disease, but I suspect they're also simply stressed to death. So we have none of these problems with our bees. We obviously, with honeybees, intermittently have to take care of varroa mite infestations and so on. But this can be, if you take good care of your bees, is typically not too difficult to control. And with wild honeybees, there isn't that sort of problem. With wild bees, they suffer other than bees. So there are about 20,000 species of bees, which many people are unaware of. And the wild bees, of course, do not have any kind of lobby looking after them. They suffer often tremendously from habitat loss due to agricultural industrialization and monocultures, but also due to pesticides. So, of course, dozens of pesticides are typically sprayed on all our crops, often without any kind of need to. People just do it prophylactically. And that affects wild bee populations in very worrying ways, with the result that many of them are now already locally extinct and many others under threat.
Some of the more concerning side of it. Thank you for that answer. We have Carl would like to ask a question next.
Yeah, I'm shocked to hear that the treatment of any domesticated animal involves abuse and disease. But my question is historical. How do you view, you showed us some quotes from about a century ago. How do you view the work of Donald Griffin in the development of these realizations and these ideas? I know he was really out front in the 1970s with his book, The Question of Animal Awareness, that included a lot about bees. And he was professionally excoriated for, these ideas and thoughts. Never mind the data, but how do you view where he sits in the development of these ideas and our own awareness?
That's a very good question. So, I mean, I think in our understanding of animal minds, including insects and cephalopods and so on, people of my generation, I have to be quite honest, are basically riding a wave. I guess we're all nudging each other on, encouraging each other, but we are not, I guess, in a sense, courageous pioneers in the way that people in the 70s or earlier were in their explorations of animal intelligence. And I can tell you another even earlier story from an African-American scholar, Charles Turner, who was active in the late 19th, early 20th century, who expressed many of these ideas a century ahead of his time about insect intelligence, about the possibility of insect emotions, about individual differences, and so on. He published over 70 articles, including a few in some of the most prestigious journals in science, such as the journal Science, from an extremely disadvantaged point. So he was not able, because of his ethnicity, to find employment at a major research university, and did much of his work from the position of a high school teacher without access to a library, a modern lab, without access to people who help in a laboratory, such as PhD students, postdocs, technicians, and so on, as a single figure. So it's a kind of superhero for me. And so his ideas were certainly out there. They were even cited at the time, but were forgotten for all the wrong reasons, of course, or almost forgotten. And so I think, yeah, hats off to these early pioneers who already, way before the current fashionable wave of exploring animal intelligence, had the insight and the courage to step up and say, I think this is going on. So likewise for Donald Griffin, who was, of course, I guess, operating from a slightly more privileged position as a Harvard scholar. But nonetheless, as you say, I guess he was somewhat ridiculed for his claims about animal consciousness, but they were, of course, very visionary.
Great. Okay, Ken, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Fascinating talk. Thank you. I am curious about if there's any research that you could speak of about the microbiome of the bee, not only the external aspects of the bee's body, but also on the interior of the bee. And does the bee have any kind of a vagus nerve that we know of?
Mm-hmm. So yes, there is quite a bit of work around the microbiome of various species of bees. And indeed, one of my former PhD student, Li, she now runs her own investigations, did a study that the microbiome is actually linked to cognition, so that certain microorganisms in the digestive system of bees are linked to improved learning performance when it comes to memorizing multiple different colors. So that's, I guess, mirrors similar investigations in other animals. Now, the nervous system of bees, of course, is entirely convergently evolved to that of the vertebrates. So the last common ancestor of the insects and vertebrates, of course, would be an early Cambrian animal that would be, well, probably worm-shaped is all we can reconstruct. And so all the future sophistications in the evolution of both branches, both evolutionary branches, including their nervous systems, have been the result of convergent evolution. Now, there are functional similarities, but there isn't something that you could call a vagus nerve in bees. I'm curious why you asked that question, actually.
Mainly because I'm really fascinated by the development of the microbiome in humans, but also some research I've been exposed to about the microbiome of cockroaches, sharing a very similar microbiome to humans, mainly because they're eating a lot of the same food, but also this idea of emergent intelligence, the idea that, you know, our own being, we don't imagine ourselves as being an emergent intelligence, but I'm quite convinced that not only through our own microbiome, but through our own brain development and then research following the development of our own bodies and intelligence itself is related to the microbiome. So that's why I was curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's curious that, of course, we tend to think of bees as having a largely vegan diet because they obviously are not carnivorous. They basically obtain all their nutrition, pollen, and nectar from flowers. But actually, floral nectar is often seething with microorganisms, which have many of the same proteins as you would get if you had a carnivorous diet. So it's not quite so simple as people imagine in terms of the consumption of the food of bees. And a lot of it, of course, in the nectar is microorganisms that subsequently settle in bees' digestive systems as well.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
More similarities between humans and bees, and maybe also cockroaches. So this is a great discovery for us. Thanks, Ken. Thomas, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. I have a question. First of all, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I have a question. Maybe I missed something, but I wasn't sure if there's any indication that bees are using scent in any of the behavior that we've seen. I'm thinking in terms of some of the things I've seen in Africa with the so-called army ants, Doralus, and how in which individuals from one colony immediately recognize members from another colony and will dismember them immediately within seconds. And I assume that had something to do with scent, but I wonder if you could offer some comments on the role of scent in terms of communication or just anything, understanding.
Mm-hmm. So you haven't missed anything, I just haven't covered it, but there is a lot of work indeed about communication by pheromones. So of course, much of the communication in cavity nesting bees, whether they're honeybees or bumblebees or stingless bees, takes place in the complete darkness of the nest. And so communicating with chemical substances is indeed widespread. And not only that, of course, the chemical substances, in many cases, the responses to them are hardwired. They're used as communication signals that have a fairly inflexible response. But of course, bees can also learn about particular scents. And as you said, colonies will take on their own colony-specific scents that is in part inbuilt into, well, basically it's hereditary, but also it of course depends on what kind of flowers they bring, nectar they bring back, and pollen bring back to the nest, which also defines the colony's scent. And indeed, guard bees that are specialists at defending the colony, so they'll sit near the nest entrance, will typically antenate any intruders and try to pick them out and either attack them or, in some cases, as you say, sting them. It doesn't always work. So intruders sometimes do get by and raid other colonies. But yes, the recognition is by chemical cues. And of course, a lot of bees' interactions with flowers are also determined by scent, by the scent of the flowers. And they can also, in addition to using visual cues, can learn the odor cues that define a particularly rewarding flower species. But more interestingly, I guess, in the context of imagining things in your minds, it turns out that if, for example, you train bees to associate certain locations that they are familiar with certain scents, so they remember location A is linked to geranium scent and location B is linked to lemon scent. If you then blow the same kinds of scents that they previously know from locations outside their hive, if you blow these scents into the hive, they spontaneously activate the memory for the correct location and then fly out to these locations thinking, aha, that scent is familiar to me. I know it occurs at location A or location B, and then fly straight to that location, which means that in this case, they can actually flexibly access past memories that are linked to spatial positions using chemical cues.
Thank you. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
Right.
Thank you, Thomas. We have another question from Mark. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Been listening with a lot of interest to this. I I'm interested in the magnetoreception, the magnetic sense that's been attributed to bees and pigeons and a lot of other species. How widespread is magnetoreception? Is it kind of common to all bee species or only some bee species and closely related insect species?
Mm-hmm. So that's a very good question. We don't know, is the honest answer. So there is at least some evidence from a variety of different teams that there is a sensitivity to magnetic fields in bees. It's much better studied in some other animals, such as monarch butterflies, for example, and some migratory butterflies in Australia as well. We still don't really know how it works. It's a very lively debate, of course, in the bird literature, less so in the insect world, but there's still a lot of controversy surrounding what the mechanism might be. So there doesn't seem to be a simple single sensory organ in the same way as, let's say, the eye is responsible for the visual sense, the antenna for olfaction and the tactile sense and so on. So we still don't know how it works, but it seems certain that at least some insect species use it. Whether it's generally widespread, we don't know. Of course, there are many insect species for whom the reliable navigation between a home base and just outside destinations is less important. So if you're, let's say, a hoverfly or a dragonfly, then navigating between defined points in your environment is less important. So perhaps you're less likely to find such navigational abilities there, but that's speculation. I don't think it's been tested.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thanks, Mark. Con?
When I've watched honeybees dance in an observation hive, it looks to me like the dance is limited to a very small portion of the colony. Now, I understand that they also produce sound during the dance, but my question is, how many bees can a dancer actually recruit? Is there a widespread spreading of the dance through the colony, or does an individual worker recruit only a small number and then it cascades as they come back and do their dances?
It's the latter. So if you observe the effects of dance communication, then from the perspective of, let's say, an artificial feeding station, they are certainly dramatic. So you may find that within 5 minutes, you have, after a single bee's visit, you might have 10 bees, another 10 minutes, and you might have 50 bees. And within an hour, there might be 400. And so perhaps to explain briefly to some members of the audience who might not be fully familiar with the dance language, it's a symbolic communication system by which bees can tell each other about the precise coordinates of the feeding site that they've discovered. And they do this on the vertical comb in the darkness of the hive, so they can't see each other. And so what you observe, what Con has observed when looking into a hive, is that individual bees will run around in a repeated motor display. That's why it's called a dance, this repeated display that roughly takes the shape of the figure 8, except the central line where the two loops overlap is a sort of a stretch rather than just a, so it's a few centimeters long rather than just a crossing over point. And this central straight run tells other bees about where the food is. The longer bees spend on this straight run, the further away the food source. And the angle, again, remember we're on a vertical comb, the angle of this run relative to gravity tells other bees where that location is relative to the sun. So if the waggle run is straight up, that tells other bees fly to the sun to get the food. If the waggle run is straight down, that means fly away from the sun, opposite where the sun currently is positioned. and any angle in between, let's say 45 degrees to the right of the vertical, means to other bees fly 45 degrees to the right of the sun. Now, as we mentioned, this all happens in the dark. Bees can't see it, so they have to follow each other physically. So the dance attendees have to touch the dancing bees using their antenna. They put them on the abdomen of the dancing bee and follow it through these repeated circles. And that, of course, greatly limits the number of bees that can pick up the information at any one time. So up to 3, 4, 5 maximally bees can follow a single dancing bee and then inspect the food source by themselves. And if they found it rewarding, they'll come back to the colony, deliver their dances indicating the same coordinates, but each bee can now be followed by another 3, 4, 5 follower bees. And so the whole system can snowball until hundreds of foragers pile up on that food source, all exploiting the same source. So the number of individuals to whom the information is transmitted by one bee is quite small, but because more and more bees deliver the same information, it's a very efficient way of getting lots of foragers to the same location.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Lars. I think we'll take one more question. We have Winnie would like to ask a question. If you just unmute yourself, Winnie, we can't yet hear you. Yeah. Fantastic.
I wanted to ask a question about a very different insect system, not social, where clearly
Can't hear anything.
clearly the bees are dealing with a very intricate environment, and there has to be some very interesting mental processing going on. I work in the tropics in Costa Rica, and part of my work is a caterpillar rearing program that has been going on for 40 years or more and has reared more than 10,000 different species, let alone specimens, Lepidoptera, and they have parasites or parasitoids in the entomologist system, and they have hyperparasites, and all of this in an immense diversity of different plants, different host plants. Part of the outcome of this has been that most of these insects are incredibly host specific. So if you are a mother Lepidopteran, or worst of all, a hyperparasite wasp, you have to find Lepidoptera in the host plant, distinguishing amongst all these plants. If you're a parasitoid, you have to find where these caterpillars are hanging out amongst their host plants. And if you're a hyperparasite, you have to actually find out the caterpillars that are already parasitized by a fly or a wasp on the caterpillar's host plants. Now, obviously, this is not something you survive unless there's a lot of processing going on. And I was immensely grateful to you to point out that while the brains are tiny, they are very, very intricately structured. But I just wanted the rest of you to give some thought to what is, to me, far more complex than a bee going to a flower source and communicating it back to the society. Something massive is going on, clearly, and we don't know what. Obviously, nobody is studying this, or only in the sense of crop pests.
Yeah, I mean, I think bees are relatively privileged and spoiled relative to, for example, predators and parasitoids and so on, because bees' targets want to be seen. Flowers, plants make an active investment into just putting their food on display. They advertise it. They actually invest energy, developmental resources into highlighting, here's food, come here. And of course, with most other biological food, instead, the prey wants to hide itself, which places much greater demands on the skills of the animals who seek out that food. And yes, as you say, unlike your, let's say, if you're not a social generalist wasp, then in many cases that has resulted in specialization. And indeed, in some cases, certain, let's say, solitary bees that are specialized in harvesting nectar only from a limited number of species have enlarged olfactory centers for detecting just these particular flower scents, not so much others. I think what we often see in the literature is a kind of underlying assumption that that makes the world simpler, that you can explain rather than through learning and any kind of cognitive processing, that there are simple trigger mechanisms by which these predators or parasitoids basically detect a chemical and then they fall out of the sky and attack the prey that's advertised or that is defined by certain chemicals. And I suspect that there is a lot more going on. So many of these parasitoids, for example, are tremendously clever in their spatial learning. They don't remember just multiple different locations where their prey occurs, but they actually remember the developmental stage and come back to these locations much later when the prey is at the right stage. They often maintain multiple nests simultaneously, as opposed to bees, which just have one nest. Parasitoids can have several and keep track of how recently they've provisioned each nest. So just to come back at the right moment in time to provision the brood with the right amount of food. So I think these species, as you say, are understudied. We use bees because they're relatively easy to train, because they're just hungry for sweet things, and whenever we deliver them, the bees come back. They also come because they're social in large sample sizes, but that doesn't mean that the world of solitary insects, many of which with these kinds of biologies that you describe, are any less fascinating, including in terms of their intelligence and cognition.
If you forgive me one more comment, in the process of this long-term research project, we have many, many anecdotes to back up the different species, of course, are doing very intricate things, but I obviously can't spend time on that now.
Yeah, but by all means, put them in the public domain. I think Donald Griffin, for example, who was mentioned earlier, made a great point in his writings that we should take these anecdotes of intelligent animal behavior seriously and not be shy of writing about them, because they are often very important in our understanding of animal minds. And even if they're just single observations, they could then, of course, be further studied with sample sizes under higher sample sizes under more controlled conditions. But if people don't report these observations, then of course there's nothing, or it will take many more accidents before people will actually take note and study these more systematically, which in turn might lead to an under-appreciation of possible cases of animal intelligence. So thanks for bringing that up.
Great. I think that's a wonderful moment to leave our discussion today. I think this has been really fascinating. And as we've all talked about, this is such a tiny mind, but in fact, it indeed is not at all tiny in any way. So I think this is a wonderful thing for us to take out into our weekend. Please, if anybody would like to, I've added the link to our Slack group in the chat, so you're welcome to go and continue the conversation there. And of course, we will have our next talk coming up in around a month's time, which you'll all be invited to. So thank you very, very much for joining us, Lars, on behalf of the Interspecies Internet, all our trustees and our community. Thank you very much for sharing, and we will see you next time.
All right, and have a great weekend, everyone.